welcome everyone to the last HSGG spring seminar for the quarter. And today we'll be having Xavier Nogueira presenting, and he's a master's candidate in the hydrologic sciences program, presenting his master's exit seminar. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end. If you want to, if you have any questions during the presentation, just put them into the chat. We'll get to them at the end. And this will be recorded and available upon request. Yeah, and here to introduce Xavier is Professor Greg Pasternak.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm Xavier's master's thesis advisor. And so Xavier got his undergrad degree from Temple University, where he did work on remote sensing of glaciers. So that was really good preparation for coming into our program. It's such a unique situation because, Xavier was with us for 9 months, 6 months before the pandemic hit, and then off he went. And so that's, many of you may be in that similar cohort, but for me, he sort of will be unique. He'll hopefully be the only student who has that short of a time, and that has largely been sort of it's like degree by mail or whatever, like degree online. And so that definitely has been a unique research experience. But the thing is, he's just been so motivated with his work, real go-getter in everything, super imaginative and creative, but dedicated with his coding. And so I think that it has worked out that he's been able to do everything, with really quite a lot on his own without having to have a lot of input from me. And so it's a super ambitious, large project. It's kind of hard to cram into a short exit seminar. It's almost halfway to a PhD if you wanted it to be. But anyway, and as always, building on the work of previous students, including Kenny, who's I think here, and hopefully many future students will build on Xavier's code base as well.
Thank you for that, Greg, and thank you everyone for showing up to my exit seminar. I guess I'm starting now, Ariel. But today we're going to talk about.
Yep.
Today we're going to talk about a geomorphic analysis of 35 flashy-ephemeral river reaches with variable channel morphologies in the South Coast, California. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to start about talking about a specific geomorphic mechanism known as flow convergence routing, as well as the background information required to understand it. Then we're going to talk about the variable channel morphologies that exist within the South Coast and how they can be meaningfully classified and grouped. Then we're going to talk about our methodologies for using remote sensing to geomorphically analyze these different variable channel morphologies. We'll transition to discussing our results and findings and how this fits into river restoration design applications, as well as reservoir flow regulation. So starting off with our overarching question is, what are rivers' nested topographic structures? And how do they differ among regions' diverse river types? Now, to understand this, we have to understand that river valley topography can be understood as nested. What do I mean by this? As discharge increases, so does water surface elevation, which we'll hereby be referring to as flow stage. As flow stage increases, the scale of topography that the flow interacts with changes. We can see here in this figure, as the flow increases, the topography that in a given cross-section of the river that the flow is interacting with shifts and evolves. Now, this tends to not be done continuously, as river channel topography typically has various flow stage thresholds. An example of this could be a flow getting high enough where it spills over the banks out onto the floodplain, which is a sudden threshold and change in the topography interacting with the flow. Or in the example shown in the figure here, a combination of a split channel in the third frame, where what is once two channels at a lower flow becomes one larger channel. Now, why is this important? It's because the cross-sectional topography that a flow interacts with steers the flow and therefore partly controls the hydraulics of the flow. This can be understood in a much more simplified example where decreasing the cross-sectional area, as shown in the figure in the right on the top, causes flow to converge and velocity to increase. Vice versa, when you increase the cross-sectional area, you have flow diverging, kinetic energy dissipating, and velocity dropping. Now, within the context of rivers, knowing that that cross-sectional area has an effect on velocity is relevant because velocity controls patterns of deposition and scour within the channel's sediment. Now, flow convergence routing essentially as a theory combines this idea of nested fluvial topography, whereas flow stage increases, the cross-sectional geometry shifts, with the idea of cross-sectional geometry controlling hydraulics and therefore sedimentary dynamics to suggest that that topography, flow stage dependent topography, controls patterns of flow convergence and divergence, which in turn controls patterns of deposition and scour. And such convergence and divergence could be forced by either width or bed elevation undulations. Now, an important caveat with flow convergence routing is this prediction that flow convergence will be associated with increased velocity in their scour, and flow divergence would be associated with decreased velocity and therefore deposition, is only relevant when the flow is morphologically relevant. The flow can be able to mobilize the bed load and move the sediment at all to begin with. Therefore, we can see here an example at a low flow, which is not morphologically relevant. We have these high depositionary zones pointed out as ripples on the diagram and these scoured out low bed elevation pools. And we see that the ripples, we have high velocities over the ripples because the flow is forced to converge vertically as it goes over the ripple. But then we have low velocities at the pool because the flow diverges vertically with the increase in cross-sectional area. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what flow convergence routing would expect. And the key here is that this is not a morphodynamically relevant flow stage. But as you increase to, let's say, a flood flow, you can see that the ripples are nested within wider cross-sections that cause flow divergence and the deposition that maintains the ripple's elevation in the first place. And vice versa, you see that a width constriction could be forcing the scour, which carves out the pool, which we see in the lower flow as well. Now, this is also supported by 2D hydraulic modeling data, where we see that wide cross-sections, shown in the graph as green and black lines, have lower velocities than narrow cross-sections, shown as the red and blue line, across an entire range of discharges in a modeled river channel. Now, why is this important to understand what controls sedimentary dynamics within a river, other than really just the sake of general curiosity? And that's because what is sediment in a river, or what is riffles or pools to a geomorphologist, is habitat for riverine ecosystems. And riverine ecosystems have been increasingly degraded throughout recent history. And in California, there's been a lot of funds and a lot of attention given to prioritizing riverine ecosystems and restoring them to a sustainable place. And for example, aspects of river channel topography can be especially important to prioritize species such as salmonids. An example of this is riffle pools, which are, as we just saw in the previous slide, undulations in bed elevation going from high riffles to low pools. This creates topographic heterogeneity that provides suitable habitat for salmonoid species across their various life stages. And we often, river restoration projects often try to create riffle pool habitat or otherwise suitable habitat, but they suffer from the issue where over decadal timescales, some around 30%, some studies suggest around 30% of projects will see geomorphic degradation from bank erosion, channel incision, over-widening, and substrate homogenization, which degrades the entire river restoration project design, and also, degrades the effectiveness of the funding for that project, which can be considerable in some cases, where many river restoration projects that cost more than $10 million is not necessarily unseen. Another application is reservoir flow regulation, and this is especially a big one in California with so many reservoir-controlled river reaches. And reservoir flows releases have been increasingly used to target aspects of sort of the natural hydrology of a river to promote a variety of ecosystem services. Sometimes it's just to overflow it to get groundwater recharge in the floodplain, but doing environmental flows or flow regulation with the aims of restoring or preserving riverine habitat, being able to understand at what discharges, what flow stages are maintaining the topographic heterogeneity that provides the habitat for the riverine ecosystem. This is vital, and it would allow flow releases to be very precisely targeted with a level of sort of scientific precision and geomorphic backing that has not necessarily been seen yet. So how do we quantify a mechanism like flow convergence routing across the longitudinal profile of fluvial topography, which can be as well as within its various nested levels? And one way to do this has been geomorphic covariance structure analysis, which has been pioneered by a variety of recent papers. And GCS more fundamentally can characterize the bivariate longitudinal series of any two river metrics. This could be something like curvature or sediment size or a habitat index. But in the context of flow convergence routing, this is standardized width, which is width relative to what's typical of that channel, and standardized detrended bed elevation, which serves as a proxy for depth and essentially captures relative highs and relative lows within the channel. GCS analysis, unlike more traditional cross-section sampling approaches where you try to randomly sample cross-sections from different parts of a river reach in field analysis or stuff like that, an advantage of GCS analysis is it's extracted from high-resolution digital elevation models, and you can extract continuous, exhaustive picture of longitudinal fluvial topography and the variability within. Here we have an example of that with the standardized width series, where you can see over close to 3,000 feet of the longitudinal profile. We can see standardized width go up and down, where you have kind of wider zones and narrow zones and plenty of pretty fine scale topographic heterogeneity. Now, GCS, a main advantage of GCS analysis is that it could be directly conceptually linked to the hydromorphodynamic mechanism of flow convergence routing. For example, just like we discussed with flow convergence routing, we would expect at morphologically relevant discharges a wide cross-section to be associated with deposition and therefore higher bed elevation. Therefore, that would be a positive value for standardized width and a positive value for standardized detrended bed elevation. And vice versa, we'd expect that narrow cross-section would cause flow convergence and scour, resulting in a negative where a negative width, standardized width value would be associated with a negative standardized detrended bed elevation value. And what you notice here is that in both of these cases, what's predicted by flow convergence routing is positive standardized width, standardized detrended bed elevation covariance. So a key analysis metric is the covariance of standardized width and standardized detrended bed elevation, which can be calculated across the entire longitudinal profile of the river for a given flow stage, and it's simply found by multiplying the standardized width series by for a given cross section by the standardized detrended bed elevation. You can see here an example of that on the bottom with a wide high bed elevation cross section. And here's just an example of that again, showing it in the series. You can see at the top is a standardized width series, and then we can see in the middle is the standardized detrended bed elevation series, and on the bottom is the covariance series. And we can see where the dotted line is. This sort of shows an example where you have a spiking covariance where the width goes down and the standardized detrended bed elevation goes down at the same time. Another way to characterize the longitudinal topography in relation to flow convergence routing is landform classification. This is also done at the sort of continuous cross-section scale. And rather than covariance, which is a continuous value where higher values are kind of more in accordance with the predictions of flow convergence routing theory, and lower and negative values are not expected to be as abundant in morphologically relevant discharges. Similarly to that, this can capture that potential for flow convergence routing, but it can capture it with landform sort of archetypal cross-sectional geometries that are associated with observable landforms. An example of this would be wide bars, which is a positive covariance landform where you have a wide depositional zone, or constricted pools, which, as we've been discussing, is where a width constriction causes a scalar pool. Then you have negative covariance landforms like nozzles, where you have high bed elevation and constriction, and then you have oversize, which is low bed elevation, deep, and wide at the same time. These landforms are classified with 0.5 standard deviation thresholds, and it has to meet the threshold for both of them. So you can see in this square here, you'd essentially plot the standardized width and the standardized detrended bed elevation of cross-section, and if it's in the zones of the landforms, it'd be classified as such. And you can also see in the figure to the right that these landforms can be nested within each other, within the nested topographic structure of a river channel. An example here is a nozzle. What it might be a nozzle at a low flow with high bed elevation and narrow could be within a wide bar at a higher flow. And that's actually an expected orientation by flow convergence routing theory, as we sort of showed in the previous illustration. Here's just an example of how you can classify a point like that, and an example of how covariance series can be nested and how we can classify landforms longitudinally. You can see that the colors show cross-section landform classification, and that some cross-sections change landform going from base flow to bank flow to flood stage, going down in the plots. Next, we're going to change gears and talk a little bit about the channel morphology variability that exists within the South Coast. So the South Coast, at least for our purposes, is a subregion of California defined by the California Water Boards, and it's used for management purposes, and it's defined on ecological and morphological grounds. Now, extensive, this project is building on the shoulders of all sorts of excellent work. One example of this has been extensive field work and algorithmic classification of the type of channel types within the South Coast. And this was done recently within our lab group. And in the South Coast, they identified 5 channel types that are sort of maximally contrasted and associated with sort of observable and understandable channel morphologies. And within this, confinement is kind of the top level differentiator, where you have confined reaches, and this refers to the distance from the Thalweg, which is the deepest point of the channel, to the valley wall. And in mountainous settings, the valley walls can be highly confined, very, very short distance, no floodplain, not much space to meander or move, while in very large alluvial valley settings, we can see highly unconfined settings with valley walls more than 1 kilometer away in some cases. And now here's the 5 channel type classes that the analysis resulted in. We see channel type class 1, which is unconfined uniform sand gravel. We sampled 6 reaches of those. Channel type class 2 is partly confined, high width to depth ratio. So these are very wide and shallow river reaches, and split channel, and we'll get to that in a second. Then we have confined cascade step pool cobble boulder, confined uniform gravel cobble, and partly confined riffle pool gravel cobble. Now, just statistically, the analysis done found that confinement with the depth ratio, bed slope, and depth variability to be sort of the most differentiating metrics. And we can see, some of the things we just discussed here, where with the depth ratio is very characteristic of channel type class 2. We can see that the confined channel type class 3 and channel type class 4 have very high bed slopes. And we can see that valley walls, the valley confinement metric is much higher for channel type class 1. Going through these channel types briefly to give you an understanding of what we're really talking about here. Here we have channel type class 1. These exist in large alluvial valley settings with low slopes. And if you map the elevation profile of the Thalweg going downstream, it's very smooth. It's not characterized by undulation. The river loses elevation in a smooth manner, and you frequently have a meandering landform. Channel type class 2. This includes kind of archetypically braided river reaches, as well as sort of anastomosing split channel river reaches where the channel splits and rejoins itself. These are found in partly confined settings, so closer valley walls, but but not right up on it, often on the order of like 100 meters to like 750 meters away. And you don't necessarily have too much bed undulation when you map out the longitudinal elevation loss. And these also exist typically in low slopes. Then also in the partly confined setting, we have channel type class 5. This is characterized by riffle pool morphology, which is what we were discussing with undulatory bed elevation profile, as well as gravel cobble sediments. Riffle pools, as mentioned, have been the subject of many of studies due to their relevance for salmonid species and riverine ecology. These are found in kind of foothill mountains and uplands and alluvial valley settings with low to medium slopes, and typically with floodplain development, riparian vegetation populated with woody plants. Then we have the confined cascade step pool cobble boulder class. Here we also have very undulatory bed elevation profile with like little, like it's a cascade, you know, it's you have pools, you have tight, lots of very, very coarse boulder sediments. These are in very mountainous settings, very confined, often with no floodplain development whatsoever and high slopes. Also in confined settings, but less erratic and with much smoother elevation profiles, is channel type class 4, which is confined, uniform gravel cobble. Sediment size tends to be lower. Slopes are still high, but lower than they are typically in channel type class 3. And that's what that looks like. Here we have a map of all our 35 sampled reaches across the South Coast, as well as their channel type class, which was very carefully classified for each with analysis of digital elevation models, aerial photography, as well as various river metrics. And with those, we want to analyze all of these with GCS analysis in relation to flow convergence routing theory, and do this importantly without going to any of them. So we take a full remote sensing approach, which is relatively a novel scale of analysis. There's been plenty of high resolution geomorphic analysis on rivers, and there's been plenty of large sample sizes of diverse rivers, but there hasn't been many analyses that combine the two, where you do a high resolution 1 meter digital elevation model based analysis on a large sample of diverse rivers. So that's one of the key sort of contributions I hope to make with the study. And the main goal of our methodology is to go from a LiDAR point cloud capturing the river channel area to longitudinal width and detrended elevation series. We start by generating a digital elevation model from LiDAR point clouds. And this is the reason we're using a Flashy-ephemeral river reaches, is because typical airborne LiDAR cannot penetrate water. Therefore, you cannot capture channel topography without doing field work or acquiring aerial bathymetric LiDAR. And aerial bathymetric LiDAR has a lot of future, but the current coverage just is not there. There is not data availability for large parts of California, and you could not do this kind of analysis across so many rivers with aerial bathymetric LiDAR in 2020. So we were forced to study ephemeral rivers to use normal LiDAR so we can capture the channel morphology by selecting only LiDAR projects done in the sort of the middle of the dry season. And we processed the LiDAR point clouds to remove vegetation, and this was done with a Python script pioneered by Kenny, who is in the crowd here today, as well as based on research by Jason Wedge. Then we have a 1 meter resolution digital elevation model capturing channel topography as well as valley scale topography. And then we want to detrend it. And the point of detrending this by the Thalweg, which is the path of the deepest point of the river, is so you could essentially add a plane, like 1 foot above the Thalweg, to correspond to water surface elevation for flow stage, and try to replicate without having to do very time-consuming 2D hydraulic modeling at the large scale, try to replicate different flow stages and capture their wetted area or wetted extent. So this is done by making a least cost algorithm, capturing the longitudinal elevation profile, then fitting the longitudinal elevation profile to a linear model or linear piecewise model, and then subtracting that linear piecewise model, capturing residuals for 3 feet spaced sort of continuous Thalweg elevation points. Then this is used with a sort of nearest methodology where the entire DM can be detrended by the Thalweg elevation profile. Then we analyze at 0.1 foot increments how the wetted area changes, and you can plot wetted area as a curve with flow stage. In doing this, as well as examining aerial photography and the details of the digitally modeled topography, we select 3 flow stages so we can sort of go 3 analogous flow stages for each of the 35 reaches so we can do comparison. And this is base flow, which is kind of a low flow, bank flow, which is has had many different meanings in fluvial geomorphology. For us, we're just capturing this kind of main channel flow where it's well carved in, and then a flood stage which spills out onto the valley and either interacts with the valley wall or often some terracing that's not going to be submerged within a reasonable discharge. Next, we want to extract the longitudinal series of standardized width and standardized detrended bed elevation. And you can see here on the right, this is what I mean by continuous analysis. Instead of having to sample random cross-sections, we are capturing sort of the entire longitudinal extent of fluvial topography by not just using cross-sections, but using cross-section rectangles. And the width of these rectangles is a function, it's about 1/20th of bankful width. So it's a function of bankful width. And for each of these rectangles, we can calculate the width of it, as well as the mean detrended bed elevation below it on the digital elevation model. And with all these series for all 35 river reaches classified within the 5 channel type classes, we can answer a couple different scientific questions. One of them is, what are a river's nested topographic structures, and do they differ among the region's diverse river types? A way to do this is looking at with standardized width and standardized detrended bed elevation covariance. As we were discussing earlier, positive covariance is associated with flow convergence routing, and negative covariance is not anticipated at morphologically relevant flows. So we can look at whether there's statistically significant differences in mean covariance within different channel type classes between the different flow stages. In addition, if there are statistically significant relationships between covariance and flow stage, do these relationships have different natures in different channel type classes? So kind of broadly speaking, we can see that there are statistically significant, using Welch's t-test, relationships between mean covariance and flow stage in all channel types except channel type class 2, which is the split channel high width to depth ratio. And there's a couple, like 3 patterns that are observable. The first one we see in an unconfined setting where there's a clear statistically significant peak in covariance at bankful alone, where you have approximately a means of around 0, which essentially indicates that the topography is not negatively correlated or positively correlated. It could just be relatively Gaussian or width and detrended bed elevation are not related. We see that at both base flow and flood stage, but at bankful alone, we see this very high, clear peak in covariance that shows that flow convergence routing is likely playing a dominant role at bankful scale discharges in maintaining channel topography. Another pattern we see is a reversal, going from negative mean covariance values to positive mean covariance values from base flow to bankful, but then tapering off at bankful to flood stage where covariance values stay around the same. We see this both in confined uniform gravel cobble settings, channel type class 4, and partly confined riffle pool gravel cobble settings, channel type class 5. Although we see a stronger sign of a reversal, it goes from more negative to more positive in channel. Well, it goes from similarly negative mean to more positive in channel type class 5 than channel type class 4. The final pattern we see is a constant increase in mean covariance with flow stage. And we see this in the confined cascade step pool cobble boulder class, where flow stage, where mean covariance increases from base flow to bank full, and then again from bank full to flood stage, all statistically significant. Another way to analyze this topography, instead of looking at reach average mean covariance values, we can look at the entire distribution of cross-section values within different channel type classes. And since both standardized width and standardized detrended bed elevation are standardized by the mean, if there is no relationship, you'd expect to see a relatively Gaussian, which we see in the bottom right, kind of even 2D distribution. And we see that in certain cases, channels don't match this and show some 2D organization. But the main takeaway here is that within similar confinement settings, well, first of all, we see a general trend with more confinement, there's more 2D organization of values. But within similar confinement settings, the more undulatory channel morphologies that are characterized by channel beds with higher relative highs and and more pronounced relative highs and lows have more bivariate organization. Here's an example of this in the confined class, where we have channel type class 3 defined by cascade step pools, which are very undulatory, and channel type class 4 characterized by a uniform bed elevation, a more uniform bed elevation. And we see that channel type class 3 is the density of values are much more organized, much tighter in general, and than channel type class 4. And trend holds where the 2D distribution is more organized in the more undulatory channel type in a partly confined setting as well, and even more so in this case, where channel type class 5, characterized by riffle pool undulations, shows significant grouping in 2D organization, while channel type class 2 is much more chaotic. Next, we can ask, are there statistically significant preferential landform nesting structures? So going back to the notion of the nested nature of fluvial topography, are different landforms preferentially nested within other types of landforms? And if true, are there meaningful differences between nesting structures between the different channel type classes in the South Coast? To analyze this, we basically looked at all landform transitions across the entire cross-sectional volume for each channel type class and compared to sort of a predicted volume of transitions based on the relative landform abundances. So for example, if got 25% of bankful cross-sections were wide bars, we'd expect that any given, the null hypothesis would be that any given cross-section has roughly 25% chance of being nested within that. But we see that in all channel types using a chi-square test that there's very highly statistically significant preferential nesting structures that cannot be explained by changes in relative landform abundance alone. We see that in all channel types, nozzles are preferentially nested within wide bars going from base flow to bank full, and that wide bars are preferentially nested with oversize, which actually goes against the expectations of flow convergence routing, while the nozzles within wide bars does fit the theory. The nozzle within wide bar nesting structure is also observed for the riffle pool reaches going from bank full to flood stage as well. In unconfined and partly confined settings only, we see that base flow oversized cross sections are preferentially nested within bank full constricted pools. And again, this pattern holds only for channel type class 5 going from bank full to flood stage. And we can see up in the upper right a visualization of this nesting structure, and this is for channel type class 5, partly confined riffle pool. And we can see the arrows showing these are statistically significant preferential nesting directions, where oversized is preferentially nested in constricted pool, going from base flow to bank full, and nozzle within wide bar, as well as within bank full to flood stage transition. Okay, so that was a lot. What can we take from this? Number one is that most channel types have longitudinal channel topography that is meaningfully different across flow stage thresholds. And that's just sort of interesting as a finding to begin with. This isn't governed by stochasticity. This isn't random. There are meaningful, coherent nesting structures that are common within different types of channel types. We also see that flow convergence routing's relative dominance has different relationships with flow stage across different channel type classes. For example, in channel type class 1, we can see this clear peak in flow convergence routing's dominance at bankfull. But in channel type class 3, its dominance increases, or its relative dominance increases, going from base flow all the way up to flood stage, which could potentially be a function of sediment size, where channel type class 3 is associated with the coarsest sediments, cobble boulder, and potentially we see in such a confined setting, flow convergence routing becoming more prominent only when the entire when more of the bed load is being able to be mobilized. And then a final sort of takeaway is that geomorphic covariance structure analysis can be used to coherently interpret flow convergence routing, which is a single hydromorphodynamic mechanism across a region's diverse channel types completely remotely and in a mostly automated way. And that just is a scientific contribution that, with the expansion of airborne bathymetric LiDAR coverage, could hopefully be applied to perennial rivers as well. So going back to the applications, in the context of river restoration design, flow convergence routing could be built into river restoration design to, let's say, promote a riffle pool morphology, which has actually been done on the Napa River by the Tully Consulting Group recently. And the figure here shows a constructed wide bar. You can see where it's wide, and they're trying to promote deposition in that zone. And then you can see there's a constriction before, potentially to force that divergence. In addition, one of the major issues, as mentioned, with river restoration is the potential risk for degradation and sort of the geomorphic black box nature of it, where you can make a design, but you don't really know if it's going to be able to hold up in the long term. And being able to use GCS to sort of synthetically design a river channel digitally, or attempt to design in a specific hydromorphodynamic mechanism to maintain desired topographic heterogeneity or desired in-channel habitat, that's powerful, and it could allow just river restoration to potentially be done with a higher level of precision and efficiency in the future, making the funds, which can be high for the example of Napa River, which was $21 million projects, making the funds go much farther. In the application, in the context of flow regulation, where the timing and magnitude of flow releases are manipulated to preserve ecosystem function, knowing the flow stage at which flow convergence routing is maintaining in-channel topography is critical for this. And you can specifically target that scale of topography if you have a discharge flow stage rating curve for a given river, and you can specifically target the geomorphic preservation of in-channel habitat using GCS analysis, which again is powerful and could potentially help usher in a more precise era of environmental flows. So that's my presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and thank you for listening. I would just like to briefly acknowledge the California Water Board for financially supporting this research. I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Gregory Pasternak, for all his help, Kenneth LaRue, Kenny, for really pioneering a lot of the things I worked on, Hervé for tons of advice along the way, Jason Wedge for improving my ability to process LiDAR and remove vegetation points and create digital elevation models, as well as all my other collaborators that helped me along the way. Thank you for listening, and I open it up to questions.
Very nice. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, we can start with that. I guess I could start by asking, was kind of interested in thinking about how, like you said, that geomorphic covariance, certain or the flow routing, that certain structures should promote, deposition and scour. And so, yeah, I was wondering if, if you were able to look at like the change in geomorphic covariance structure over time, or like overlaying that with the deposition and scour to see how much, like also looking at maybe like the dynamism of those features. Because I guess I would just like think, oh, well, like, when you look at it at one time, it's these structures are here, and then you look at it another time, it's going to be another set of structures. I mean, I guess if you were looking just in the lower Yuba River, right? So it's, yeah, I don't know. I guess I was wondering if you had thoughts on that, on it, whether the dynamism was important, or you were able to look at that.
Yeah, well, I feel like one of the aspects of this research that I enjoyed is it's kind of jumping ahead, right? Like, we don't have airborne bathymetric LiDAR data for tons of river reaches in this country. In fact, we have it for very little. And getting the field data to make these maps is incredibly expensive. And, in the case of the Yuba River, which you mentioned, that's been kind of a long-standing relationship where we've been able to generate these time series and stuff. And I agree. I feel like being able to do like a GCS time series or compare expected patterns of deposition and scour to observed patterns of deposition and scour, especially over like a decadal time scale, would be fascinating. And that's definitely like the next step in this research. But currently the data availability just does not exist. The LiDAR data we used was from the 2018 wildfire season, essentially. And there's not LiDAR data from before that, and there's not LiDAR data from after that. So we're working with what we have here, and we're kind of pioneering an analysis that will only be more applicable to perennial rivers in the future. But yeah, a time series analysis would be awesome.
Yeah, I think some of the idea behind flow convergence routing is that it creates self-sustaining river landforms, right? So that's sort of one of the goals, and we've been able to test that a little bit on the Yuba River. So yeah, that's very interesting, Xavier. By the way, really fabulous presentation, really, really excellent work, tremendous amount of work. I think you had some really amazing, profound results, and I do have some questions, or just want to point some things out that struck me. Since you're sharing your screen, would you mind going to slide 32? Awesome. Yeah, I think this is awesome. So here you have your unconfined uniform sand gravel channel, right? And so at base flow, this is basically like what Greg likes to call vanilla channel, essentially, right? It's like super straight. It's like has very little width, depths, undulations. And then the GCS that you've done perfectly captures that, right? It's like a super normal channel at base flow. That's awesome. So like, it's like a proof of concept in such a great way. Now, what's super cool is the change that occurs as you go to these higher flow stages, right? So like at bank full, like you get flow convergence routing. And that's really interesting, I think, for these systems. I'd love to like think about that a little bit more and what that means for, these systems that we tend to not think of as having these fluvial landforms, or having simpler fluvial landforms. But then this one was really wild, and I feel like it contrasted with some of your other channel types in that at valley full, the GCS decreases, and I like, whenever I think about this line of work, it always takes me like a really long time to like think about it. But that too is another profound effect, and it's almost like all that heterogeneity that's occurring at bankful is just getting super drowned out at the valley scale. Like you have this like vanilla channel nested in like kind of an interesting like more dynamic topography nested in like a vanilla valley. Like it's really cool.
I think part of it here is that these valley walls are so distal. So if you are interacting with valley scale topography, you're interacting at like a really dispersed low energy state that's likely not to be that morphologically relevant. One thing I think that's cool about this one is that it's probably like of all the findings, it has the most direct implication for flow regulation, where from what I understand, Oftentimes they'll release like flood flows, and this is not just for like maintaining in-channel habitat. This is also for like riparian vegetation and groundwater recharge. But in an unconfined setting, like the finding here suggests that if you want to maintain habitat, like skip the flood flows, like just aim for bank, which is an interesting takeaway.
Yeah. Anyway, I really enjoyed this slide. Going to 32, I think this was great again as like just a proof of concept that everything was working correctly, that the riffle pool channels had strong flow convergence routing signatures that increase with discharge. And then if you could go to the same slide as this one, but for those cascade channels, I'd like to see that maybe. Yeah, this one. Yeah.
No, the cascade.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. This is really interesting to me because this is kind of the zone I work in. And again, like it's hard to come up with this stuff on the fly. It's such a deep and like tough thing for me to think about. But yeah, I think it's cool that the flow convergence routing emerged only at that valley filling kind of flows. And again, I'd have to go back to the paper that Greg has submitted to really think about this. But
I think that's consistent. Like when you have say a tributary that pushes in an alluvial fan into the valley floor, right? To move that takes much bigger flows. So it's consistent with what we've seen in the mountains, that it takes a much higher discharge to reorganize these big cobbles and boulders and stuff that are the structure of these step pool stuff. But just the magnitude of the shifts here are amazing.
Yeah, this one's cool. And like, without field validation, like there's no way to know what's exactly driving this. Like that's sort of my hypothesis, is that it's the fact that the sediment size is so big, so you need a higher discharge to be able to mobilize it. But who knows? Who knows exactly what? Definitely all could use more study. Like we can go off in a million.
There's a big body of work out there on mountain rivers that really high flows are needed to do that geomorphic work and result in channel change. And there's a lot of interesting, there's a lot of work on, step pool formation and what are the morphodynamics associated with step pool formation. And no one's really tied in flow convergence routing as a mechanism that I know about. So it's interesting.